which is trust in God.
Jim, you go first. Thanks, Jim. Hey, good morning, folks. Good to be with you. Glad you're here. Susie's playing a song. She's playing a hymn. I don't know what the difference is between a hymn and a song. We'll have to ask somebody about that later, why there's a difference. But that hymn she's playing is Blessed Assurance. It was written by Fanny Crosby back in the 1800s, around 1850. And this song that she's playing is the song that Stephen Furtick, who wrote the song Trust in God, which we're going to sing at the end of the message, he heard this song in the hallway in his church as someone was playing it, and he wanted to modernize or update or enhance the lyrics as well as the melody. And so I want to read that to you as soon as I make sure things are working here. Fanny Crosby wrote, "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory." She was tasting before, foretaste. She was imagining the glory that she would experience later in life. She says, "The heir of salvation, purchased by God, born of his Spirit, and washed in his blood." Fanny Crosby wrote 9,000 hymns in her lifetime. She lived to be almost 95. You can do the math. That's a lot of hymns, even if you live to be 95. She spent her life ministering to the homeless in New York City. And the Methodist Church used to have, she was a Methodist. Go Methodist. The Methodist Church used to have a Fanny Crosby Day. We don't do that anymore. I don't know why. I don't know why we don't do it, but we don't. A Fanny Crosby Day where we would sing songs like this. So Elevation Band reworked the song, and they wove this melody into that song and modernized some of the language. And the song we're going to sing later in the service is, "Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine. He's been my fourth man in the fire time after time. Born of his Spirit, washed in his blood. And what he did for me on Calvary is more than enough." I want to talk about the fourth man. Isn't that an interesting line? He's been my fourth man in the fire time after time. Thanks, Susie. The band jokes that if Susie keeps playing, I keep preaching. You'll see that happens at the end, too. So if you grew up going to Sunday school, there's this Old Testament story about three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I remember hearing that when I was a young guy going to Sunday school back in the day. It's the story about King Nebuchadnezzar. So King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the largest empire in history at the time. So I'm going to read part of the story from Daniel chapter 3. It says, "King Nebuchadnezzar built a gold statue. It was 90 feet high and 9 feet thick. What's that say about a guy that's got to build a 90-foot tall statue? Some insecurities, right? He set it up on the Dura plain in the province of Babylon, and he then ordered all the important leaders in the province, everybody who was anybody, to the dedication ceremony of the statue. So they all came for the dedication, all the important people, it says. And they took their places before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had erected. So King Nebuchadnezzar, like I said, he's the king of the largest empire at the time. And the purpose of this statue is that he wanted the world to recognize him as a god. And or he was an egomaniac, and maybe he's both those things, right? So So after building this statue, the king issues this law, and he says, everyone must worship me, the king. But there are some Jews who say, no, they're not going to worship. See what happened? This is during the exile period, and there are Jews that were captured during war, and the Babylonians had not taken them back to Babylon, and now they work for the king. And someone comes and tells the king this, and it says, well, there are some Jews, and then he names them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have placed in high positions in the province of Babylon. And these men are ignoring you, O king. They don't respect your gods, and they don't worship the gold statue that you set up. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse to bow down. Even after being given warnings, they still won't submit. They still won't bow down. So the king orders the three of them to be thrown into a furnace to be put to death. Now, there's a longer story here, and I want to encourage you, if you haven't heard this story before, to read. It's in the Old Testament. It's in Daniel chapter 3. It's one chapter long, and you'll get a lot more information than I'm sharing with you now. But it's a great story. But you did hear me correctly. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, had a furnace where he disposed of his enemies. This furnace wasn't to heat his castle, it wasn't for any other purpose, but this furnace was to threaten and to also follow through on threats with those who didn't follow the king's orders. So the story writer tells us that he ordered the furnace fired up 7 times hotter than usual. So this fire is now, this is how angry the king is. He's 7 times hotter, all right? He ordered some strong men from the army to tie them up, hands and feet, and throw them into the roaring furnace. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bound hand and foot, fully dressed from head to toe, and we're going to talk about why the writer would mention that they're fully dressed, and they were pitched into the roaring fire. And because the king was in such a hurry, and the furnace was so hot, that flames from the furnace killed the men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to it. You know when you open the oven and that heat just gets you? All right, well, imagine 7 times hotter. So while the fire raged all around Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fire was so hot that the men who threw them into the fire, the flames killed these men. The writer says, suddenly King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm and said, "Didn't we throw 3 men, bound hand and foot, into the fire?" And all those around him said, "That's right, O king." And the king says, "But look, I see 4 men. And they're walking around freely in the fire, and they are completely unharmed." And then he says, "And the 4th one looks like a son of the gods." Now I want to pause there just for a second. If you have trouble believing this story, I get it. It's an unbelievable story. It reminded me, as I was preparing this, of the little boy from The Sixth Sense. Do you remember that movie? I see dead people. The king is saying, I see 4 men. It doesn't seem possible. But for today's purposes, if this is an unbelievable story for you and you want to see this as allegory or just a really good story, if you want to see this as like a parable, it's okay, because the principle is still true. Back to the story. Pause button off. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out of the fire. Now, I skipped a part here because you need to know that they didn't walk out of the fire because it was too hot. They didn't walk out of the fire because it was, getting smoky on them. They didn't come out of the fire because it was uncomfortable in any way. They came out of the fire because the king said, hey, why don't you guys come out of the fire? They walked out of the fire, and all the important people who were gathered there, the government leaders and the king's counselors, they gathered around to examine them and discovered that the fire hadn't so much as touched the three men. It burned off their bounds. They were walking around freely, but not a hair was singed, not a scorch mark on their clothing. Not even the smell of fire was on them. God's protection in this story was so complete that not a hair, not a scorch, not even a smell of fire was on them. And here is the principle. Whatever your circumstance, even what seems the most heated moment in your life, God is by your side. And in the midst of the greatest potential pain and suffering, God is there. You see, don't miss this. They were free in the fire. In the midst of it, they're bound, their ropes were cast off. They were free in the fire, walking around in the fire, and God was by their side. They were fine in the fire. And God's protection was so complete that they didn't even smell like smoke. And so in a few minutes, we're going to sing, He's Been My Fourth Man in the Fire, Time After Time. Band, don't come up yet. I got more to say. But maybe you're here today, and you're thinking, I can't see the fourth man. And you're saying, I'm in the fire right now, and I don't know how to get out. Or maybe you're here, or you're in person, or you're online, and you want to testify that you've felt God's presence when you walk through the fires of financial challenges or health uncertainties or broken relationships or job loss or family turmoil, or maybe you're here and you're still in that. See, I pray whatever circumstance that together we will sing, He's been my fourth man in the fire. Time after time. Time after time after time. See, sometimes we sing songs as testimonies. Sometimes we sing songs and we sing them because this happened to me. That I know that God has been with me. But there are other times that we sing songs and they're aspirational. We sing and we say, God, I want this for me. I'm in the fire right now, but I want this for me. And so the principle is that God is with us even in the most heated fire. But there's a second principle, and I would argue it's more potent and more powerful than that principle. It's also reflected in the psalm we're going to sing, but we have to go back in the story. We have to go back before the three are thrown into the fire. See, that's one of the challenges when we read the Bible is, we get the whole story, right? So we know how it ends. But to imagine what it was like in the moment, is so much more powerful. So here they are, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now the king has said, I'm going to throw you in the fire. This is your last chance. If you'll bow down, you'll live. If you don't bow down, I'm going to throw you into a fire. And they replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. Hear what they say. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. I love how polite they are, huh? Then he says, but even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Did you hear what they said? But even if he doesn't, we serve a God who is able to save us. But even if he doesn't. See, trust and faith is about believing in something we can't see. You don't need faith. You don't need trust in something if you can see it. It's about believing in something you can't see. See, their faith was not on what God was going to do. They didn't know. They didn't know the rest of the story. Their faith was in what God had done, what God was doing. That it was based on God's faithfulness and a trust that God keeps his word. See, here is that potent principle, the one that I believe is more powerful than even the first one I just shared with you, that no matter how many times or how badly people treat God, God always keeps his word. God always does what he says he will do. God may not always answer the way or when we want, but God always keeps his promises. God's word is true and good and sure. Is there anyone who will give me an amen at that? Yeah, he's true and good and sure. Now, this doesn't mean that we will never fail. It doesn't mean that there won't be fires. It does mean that God is by our side. It does mean that God never fails. It doesn't mean that our prayers are always answered the way we want them to be answered or when we want them to be answered. It means that no matter how God answers, God never fails. It means whatever may happen in life, our relationship with Jesus and God's purposes will never fail. You see, the greatest test of faith and the greatest act of trust in God is when we can't see God. When the fire seems too hot, when the smoke seems too thick, when we can't figure out where God is, when we don't know what God is going to do, but we trust that God will be faithful. See, they told the king, the God whom we serve is able to save us, but even if he doesn't, even if it seems that the fire is too hot or the smoke is too thick, but even if he doesn't answer the way I want him to, I will trust in God. That even if he doesn't come through as I expect him to, I will trust in God. That even if he doesn't, and fill in the blank, whatever it is that's in your life. That even if he doesn't do as you expect or want or desire or think, I will trust God is present with me. And it's not easy. And outside of these walls, it's not normal. And it's not expected by others around you. But even in the smoke and the fire of hardship and difficulty and illness, believing and trusting God is able, even if he doesn't. So I brought up with me this shawl. It was knit by one of the folks on our prayer shawl ministry. And there's a fine group of, beautiful group of ladies who, I think they're all ladies, they may not, who knit these. And while they knit, they pray over the person who will receive this blanket. It's not magic. It's not anything like that. It's prayer. It's that prayer is taking place for the person. And often, I've heard stories of people who have had these, and they've been prayed over and prayed for and prayed with. And sometimes those stories are that I was going through circumstances that were hot like a fire, and smoke was all around me, but I felt God's presence. And there are other times where the person who shares the story is not the person who received the blanket or the quilt, but a loved one who was there with them as they confidently and clearly and powerfully went to Jesus with full trust, not knowing, not understanding how God was answering, but knowing that God was, trusting that God was able, even if he doesn't. And they went through life's fiery furnace with not a hair singe, not a scorch mark on their clothes, not even the smell of fire on them, because their faith and trust in Jesus remained intact. So in a moment when the band comes up, we're going to sing Perfect Submission, All is at Rest. I know the author of tomorrow has ordered my steps. You see, that's another way of saying God is able, even if he doesn't. I trust the author of my steps. So the band's going to come up. You can come up now. I said it like 3 times now. Sorry. I keep saying the band's going to come up. Well, now they are going to come up. So I mentioned Fanny Crosby and the song that she sang and this song that is connected to it. And in it, Fanny lived to be almost 95. She was 94 and I think like 10 months when she died. And Fanny Crosby, her entire life, was blind. And once a preacher sympathetically made this comment to Fanny Crosby at the end of a church service. He said, "I think it's a great pity that God did not give you sight when he showered so many other gifts upon you." And she replied quickly, "Do you know that if at birth I had been able to make one petition, it would have been that I should be born blind?" And the pastor said, "Why?" And she said, "Because when I get to heaven, the first face that shall ever gladden my sight will be that of my Savior." Fanny Crosby died on February 12th, 1915, and she was blind for 94, almost 95 years. I want you to know, folks, with confidence, that on February 12th, the moment she died, her eyes were opened, and she saw Jesus. You see, you may be in the midst of what seems like a fire 7 times hotter than you can imagine. And you feel like you've been thrown into it. And you don't know where to go or what to do or how to get out. But I want you to know that we serve a God who is able. And even if he doesn't, he's a God who loves you, who stands by you, and will not fail you. And so I don't know what you may be facing. It may be a fiery furnace of sickness or financial hardship or some other calamity. But as we sing, I pray that we together here in this space online, that we would know together that there is a fourth man by our side.